think we'll get started now. Maybe wait a couple more minutes, a couple more seconds as people are coming through. Okay. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Business Support Series webinar. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Cindy, and your host for today's session. After switching gears to working from home or working within restrictions, returning to work can be both positive and stress-inducing. Working from home might lead to issues with being present, decreased productivity despite desire to be productive, and how to manage other responsibilities such as childcare. Dr. Pencer joins us today to discuss these concerns as well as concrete tips for managing stress during these difficult times. In addition, Dr. Pencer will discuss the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on mental health in the short term and the long term and provide resources for anyone that might be experiencing anxiety and depression. Thank you to those of you who submitted questions for our presenter. When we do get to the Q&A section of our presentation, we'll feel free to type any other questions into the chat box. Our presenter and guest speaker today is Dr. Alyssa Pencer, co-founder of Tranquility Online. Dr. Pencer is a co-founder and senior scientific director for an internet-based cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, company out of Nova Scotia. She previously worked within outpatient mental health services at the IWK Centre for over 10 years, providing CBT for anxiety and mood disorders, and served as the team leader for the Anxiety Clinic over several years. So welcome, Dr. Pencer, and thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Thanks. Hey. So today we're going to talk about stress and anxiety during the pandemic. And we'll talk about different aspects. You know, I did a similar talk at the beginning of the pandemic, and the stress and anxieties were a bit different then. Some of that is still the same, but we'll talk about some of the newer things that people are anxious and stressed about now. And then we'll talk about tips for things like people feel uncertain about the future, just general stress, and adjusting to change. And then I will talk about more significant mental health issues of anxiety and depression and some resources for that. This is just a bit more about me. I'm also a senior instructor at Dalhousie University in addition to my role at Tranquility. So during these unprecedented times, although I feel like our unprecedented times are, that word is unprecedented, we've never used it so much, it leads to a lot of feelings of uncertainty, right? We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I mean, as a general rule, we can't predict the future, obviously, and people have difficult times with uncertainty. We, as human beings, like to have a plan, and we like to know what's going to happen, and that's not something that is easy to happen in a regular time. But during the pandemic, this level of uncertainty of what's going to happen in the future is much higher. Sometimes people are noticing anxiety for the first time, so people are feeling particularly stressed and anxious, and it's an uncomfortable and unfamiliar feeling to them. Whereas other people during the pandemic, it's really just increased anxiety that was already there. So they would have already kind of described themselves as a bit of an anxious person, and the pandemic and the stresses associated with it are just really amplifying that anxiety that they already had. So just some of the common issues. So for people that are still working from home, or for sure when most people were working from home, it leads to issues about being present at work. Unless you're somebody who's always worked from home, you know, there are those people that have always worked from home. They already had their office. They already, you know, had a groove of how to do that. But for people that it's new, or, you know, newish, being present at work when you're not actually physically at work and that's what you're used to can be really challenging. It can also create a lack of connection to work and to colleagues. So, you know, I was just talking to some of my colleagues and the students at Dalhousie yesterday, and we talked about, it wasn't like we met all the time, but you would bump into people in the hallways or, chat after class or something like that. And so I'm sure there's a lot of workplaces like that where, if you're working from home, even if you have Zoom meetings and things like that, it's just not the same in terms of that connection to physically being at work and physically being with your colleagues. And even if you are back in the workplace, it's probably different in terms of having to socially distance, or maybe you've had to separate if you've got large teams into smaller numbers and things like that. So there is a lot of changes even for people that are back to work physically. There can be decreased productivity despite the desire to be productive. I think one thing that we'll talk a lot about today is remembering that we're still in a pandemic, and we're really lucky here in Halifax and the Atlantic bubble for the amount of things we're allowed to do, and that we can get out and do without as much worry as maybe other places in the world. But it is still a pandemic, and there are still a lot of changes and unknowns and things happening, and maybe you have a family in other places in the country or the world, or maybe it impacts maybe you used to travel a lot for work. So there's still a lot of things going on in people's heads, right? So that's something to think about in terms of productivity. Is there's still a lot of distractions and a lot of extra things to be thinking about, including some of the changes. And then people still, for sure, for a long time, many people that are parents had childcare where they couldn't send their child to school or daycare or wherever it was, or even really get a babysitter. That is less true now, which is great. But people are still talking about, some of their kids, they didn't feel comfortable putting them in after school care, or maybe the hours have changed, or things like that. And so childcare at home, after school hours and things like that still tends to be an increased pressure for some people. And then if people have headed back into the actual workplace, this can also lead to increased uncertainty, right? What's that going to be like? What if I get a cold? What do I do if my kid gets a cold? What are the new protocols? What do I have to make sure what I do is right? What happens if there's a second wave, right? So if you're back in the workplace, there's still a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of fear of illness, right? Some of it is legitimate, right? There are people that are certainly higher risk, and for those people, that fear is real. And so, worry about having to be back in the workplace if you're immunocompromised, or maybe you care for an elderly parent or a child that's immunocompromised. So there's a lot of fear around that. There's also some, I hate to use the word irrational, but maybe catastrophizing. These are big words. I think there's a lot of people that if they are prone to have those types of anxious, catastrophizing type thoughts, people tend to, their brains trick them into thinking those things are more realistic than maybe they are, or the probability is higher than it actually is. And then adjustment difficulties. So people, right, there's a lot to adjust to at home, in the world around you, and definitely in the workplace. I can't think of many workplaces where there hasn't been some adjustment during the pandemic, and shifts, right, over time as things change. My company, Tranquility, is an online company, and even we had adjustments, right? We didn't just keep doing things the way we were doing them. And even that connection to colleagues, right? We used to see people in person more, things like that. So there's a lot going on. So we're going to talk about how to manage some of these things. So I'm going to talk, this slide's going to stay up here for a while because I'm actually going to talk through each of these tips to really kind of try to provide you some hands-on ways of, and I don't want to say quick fixes, they're more short-term fixes, I guess. So this is more for when people are feeling that kind of general stress, low levels of anxiety, and maybe that those feelings of disconnection, those feelings of uncertainty, some of the things that you can do for those. I am also going to talk about what to do if it becomes more than that. So for many people, this stress and anxiety has led to significant mental health concerns. So anxiety disorders, depression, that impact their lives in a much more significant way than what I'm going to be talking about right now. So these are really just those the tips for when you're just feeling off and stressed and can't seem to get back to feeling well. And I use the term wellness. I could do a whole other webinar on what another clinician in Australia calls the happiness trap. So one of the things we're going to talk about today is aiming for happiness all the time is an unrealistic goal that we've been set up to feel in this society, that somehow we're supposed to just feel good all the time. And that was a problem pre-pandemic, and now it's an even bigger problem because it is stressful. This is a time of stress. That's the way it is. And so these strategies are really about feeling well and doing the best you can during a pandemic. So and otherwise, and other times of year. Obviously, these are not, none of these are new strategies to the pandemic. They're really, they're just general helpful strategies. So the first one. So one thing to think about is when we think about wellness, what does that actually mean? And there's a lot of research to support that as human beings, we need a few core things in order to feel well. The first is some aspects of pleasure or enjoyment in our life. So I'll talk about each of these in turn. The second is achievement, and then there's also social connection. So in terms of the first one, in terms of pleasure or enjoyment, again, this doesn't have to be, having these wonderful, big activities every day. This is just what makes you feel good for even just a little while. Is it reading a book? Is it going for a walk? Is it being in nature? This was actually a big issue during kind of the times when we were more locked down and had to stay home because I don't know, I'm sure you all remember at one point, finally our government said, okay, we can go to parks because people need to get into nature. And that's actually a well-known established idea, is that human beings need to get out into nature, need to get exercise, need to get fresh air, get sunshine, things like that. So it could just be going for a walk. That when I say scheduling activities that give you pleasure and enjoyment, it could be reading a book. It could be, I try to stay away from watching Netflix because that's a whole other kettle of fish in terms of if it's just you've got a favorite show and when you watch it you laugh and it's fantastic, that's great. If it's I sit down and binge Netflix and it's more of an avoidance strategy or procrastination strategy, or it sucks you in and then 4 hours later you're like, oh no, I didn't do anything productive, which is the next thing, then it's not the best thing. So maybe it's taking a bath, maybe it's like you haven't slowed down and just said, you know what, I'm just gonna have a nice bath tonight. Or maybe it's the last thing is social connection, maybe it's hanging out with friends, whatever it is. So having something hopefully every day, even if it's only for 15 minutes of something that you can do that brings you some type of pleasure and enjoyment. The second one, achievement. As human beings, we like to feel like we've been productive, right? And as we talked about, that can be more difficult during a pandemic or during times of stress, whatever that is. So again, when I say productive, I want to clarify. I remember at the height of the pandemic, forget which movie star it was, but was like, learn a new language, learn how to cook, like all this like fun stuff you can do that because you're stuck at home. And I remember my first thought was, must be nice to have so much money that you don't have to worry and have all this time. Anyway, but there were some people that did that, and that's fine, and there's no judging those people. If you were one of those people that was able to do that, that's great. but to put that expectation on yourself is not fair to yourself, which we will also talk about at the end, which is self-compassion. So when I talk about achievement and productivity, that could be, I did the laundry today, or, I got through this task at work, or, I, signed my kid up for swimming today, whatever it is. It's just feeling like we got something off our to-do list, kind of. It's that feeling of, if we just feel like all we're doing is like trying to catch up and we never actually achieved something, we've never actually been able to check something off that checklist, that can feel really stressful. So having that built into your daily life as well. And the last one, social connection, has gotten a bit easier, a lot easier, since we're able to, in the Atlantic bubble, see people. But that could be still an issue depending on your circumstances. So, we know now a lot about Zoom fatigue. So I know a lot of people would say when we were kind of more cooped up at home, I really want to talk to my friends, but like, at the end of the day, I'm zoomed out. And so, we would talk about at that point, if that's still something that's an issue for you, if you feel like you can't really physically get out and see people, go old school, talk on the phone, text, do other things. It doesn't always have to be that face-to-face. Social connection can be done in lots of different ways. But if you can, get out and see people, maybe, I've talked to a lot of people that talked about getting to know their neighbors during the pandemic, because, you didn't feel like you could go out and do a bunch of things, but you could talk to your neighbor across the fence or in your driveway or things like that. So keeping those things going. As human beings, we really need that social connection. And if for you that is that you have a small social group that you can see once or twice a week, that's even better if you can. So that's that first kind of formula of wellness and things you can do. One recommendation I have when thinking about that formula is to, without trying to be too overscheduled, to schedule some of these things in. So, when it comes to work, we typically know, my work day is this, and this is what I have to do, and these are when my meetings are. But when it comes to things that we want to do for ourselves, they're kind of deprioritized sometimes. And so my suggestion is to really kind of think about what these things are for you, and build them into your day, whether it's in the evening, whether it's at lunchtime, whether it's before work starts in the morning, whatever it is. As I said, some of these things can be 15 minutes, and just scheduling them in. And if something comes up and you can't do it, reschedule it just like it was a meeting or an appointment, because these things are really important. Worry time is something that people find helpful if they find themselves just going over and over and over worries in their head, right? So if you're one of those people that find yourself easily distracted at work with your thoughts, with worries, one thing that can be helpful is to try to compartmentalize those. So to kind of say, okay, I've got this worry. And the thing is if we just sit there and worry about it, our brain tricks us into thinking sometimes that worrying about it is going to somehow fix the problem or change the problem. But that's actually not true. So we end up just kind of mulling it over, and it's hard to stop it. And so what I suggest is something called worry time, which is jot those worries down, right? Whether it's on a piece of paper, we all have our smartphones next door, computers, whatever it is, just have somewhere where you can just kind of jot down the worry that you have and say, okay, I'm not going to think about that right now, but I have my scheduled worry time. So you pick a time. I don't recommend right before bed. You don't want to bring up all these worries right before bed, but maybe right after supper or before supper. You pick 15 minutes and you say, okay, I've got that 15 minutes that I can take that time to really think about this worry, and so I can leave it till then. Some people find that hard. Some people find that helpful. So anytime a worry pops up, you jot it down and you think, okay, when I have my worry time, that's when I get to think about this. And then when the worry time comes, you do have permission to think about that. So let's say it's 7 to 7:15. Okay, from 7 to 7:15, I'm going to take out my worries and I'm going to worry about them. What's interesting is most people would say it doesn't actually take up the 15 minutes. They read through them, they kind of go, okay, and then they try to think about them a bit more. For some people, maybe, you have permission to use that 15 minutes, but and for some people, maybe they do. But many people will say that strategy alone helps them in decreasing the amount of time they worry substantially. So that's another possibility. Mindfulness. Some people love the term mindfulness. Some people hate the term mindfulness. I feel like there's a few of us in the middle. But for some people, when they hear the word mindfulness, it really brings this positive feeling of kind of quiet and meditation and focus. And others think like, well, I can't meditate, so I can't do that. That's actually not the type of mindfulness I'm talking about. I'm talking about mindfulness in a more, I want to say, practical way, but also something that doesn't, again, have to take tons of time. I'm talking about just getting out of your head and into the moment, just for a few minutes. So really focusing on the present moment, because again, when we're stressed and anxious, we spend a lot of time in our head and not in the present moment. We think a lot about the future, right? That uncertainty about the future. We spend a lot of time when we're worried about that in our day, thinking about that versus what's going on right here, right now in my life. And so when I talk about mindfulness, I talk about taking a few minutes to just be present. And there's lots of different ways to do that. My favorite is an exercise that uses your 5 senses. So you just go through your 5 senses. I usually start with the easiest one. So you go 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can, hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. I usually go in that order because that's kind of like the things that are easiest to do. Seeing 5 things is a lot easier. And when I say see 5 things, I'm really talking about spending some time focusing on your surroundings. So you can be anywhere. You don't have to be outside surrounded by beautiful nature. Right now I could do it. I could say I see, my screen, which has a green square on it with writing in it. I see my picture in the corner. That's kind of distracting. Behind that, I see my chair that's brown with grainy wood in it. So you see how I'm kind of focusing on each of those things in a bit more detail. So you do that. So 5 things you can see. What did I say? 4 things you can touch. And I don't mean touch like touch the screen. I mean things like, I can feel my feet on the floor. I can feel my back in the chair. I can feel my hands are currently on the table. I can feel a coolness where my shirt hits my back, right? So those are the kinds of things in terms of touch. And then, as I said, you can do, then what you can hear. Often I find it easier to close your eyes when you're doing the listening. And then smell. I usually say just take a nice deep breath. Sometimes you can't really smell much. Sometimes there's a whole bunch of smells. So try to come up with at least 2. And then 1 thing you can taste. That's my favorite for just like a quick, but not too quick way to kind of just bring it. And then you just kind of take a deep breath. You look around you. You've kind of grounded yourself in the moment. And it can really help with that being distracted with your worries and anxiety, and bring you back to the moment. And then once you're kind of back in the moment, focus on what it is you should be doing. And then the last one is self-compassion. This is not a new concept, but it's something that people have spent more time talking about recently. We often, when we're stressed, are really hard on ourselves. We set high expectations for ourselves. We do a lot of, I should have done this. Why aren't I better at this? Why can't I focus at work? Why can't I do all this? Why can't I get anything off my to-do list? So-and-so down the hall seems to be able to do it, right? We do a lot of comparing to others in that way. And that can make us feel pretty bad about ourselves, which doesn't help, makes things worse. So a few things. When we talk about self-compassion, one of the big things, especially now during a pandemic, that I explain to people is that we are all in this together, right? Everybody is in the pandemic. And sometimes when people use that phrase, it's helpful, and other times it's not, because people think, well, as I said, like that person's able to do X, Y, and Z. So I heard this, I didn't make this up. I heard this expression a while ago, and I can't remember where I heard it, but people will say we're all in the same boat. That's actually not true. We're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. So acknowledging maybe that you might have some extra stressors or extra struggles, whether that's tangible things, right? Like maybe your job has longer hours, maybe there's a childcare issue, or maybe it's just that you don't have a lot of coping strategies for managing with stress and you're trying to figure that out. That puts you in a different boat too. And so really acknowledging that it's okay to feel stressed, and it's okay, especially during these times of uncertainty and change and adjustment. It's okay to not be okay all the time. That's part of self-compassion, is really that understanding of I don't have to be okay all the time. I don't have to meet the same expectations that I did a year ago. And part of that can be really hard, by the way. Self-compassion, being compassionate to ourselves, is so much harder than being compassionate to other people. So that's a strategy, is actually thinking about what you would say to your best friend or your partner or your child, or right, somebody that you really care about. If they came to you with the stressors and worries that you were having, what would you say to them? Because we tend to be much more understanding and compassionate to others. So, if a friend came to you and said, I just can't get anything done at work. Oh, I'm so lazy. I can't believe I can't do this. What's happened to me? Are you going to respond and say, I was thinking that. Yeah, what has happened to you? No, you're not going to do that. Maybe you are, but I doubt most people are not going to do that, right? You're going to say something nice and compassionate. You're going to say, yeah, things are really tough right now. You're going to get through this. What do you need some help? What could I do to help you? Right? That's what you're going to say to your friend. So say that to yourself. Turn it around. What are the ways that you can be compassionate towards yourself? So that's something else to think about. And then part of self-compassion is all these other things we've been talking about so far. Making time for them, prioritizing yourself, not just prioritizing everybody else and work. And because what we know is if we're stressed and anxious and don't take the time to take care of ourselves, we are less productive. We aren't as helpful to other people. And so ironically, by shifting the priorities and taking care of yourself, you actually are taking better care of other people, and you will actually be more productive at work. Okay, so in terms of when things become more significant or more serious. So what we know is prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, anxiety and mood disorders were already the most commonly experienced mental health disorders. The Center for Addictions and Mental Health in Toronto, which is the largest mental health and addictions scientific research center and health center in Canada, has been doing surveys since I think April or May. They've been doing these surveys of thousands of Canadians, and they have found a significant increase in anxiety, mood disorders, and substance use problems. It's actually been in the news. You may have seen it. Actually, just recently, it hit the news again. People are really concerned about it. Rightfully so. We've put a lot of money and effort into the actual disease, right? The actual virus. But if we don't take care of mental health, then there is going to be a significant fallout related to this pandemic. And that's to do with social isolation, loneliness, that constant uncertainty. These all have detrimental impacts on our mental health, but also our physical health. Our mental health and physical health are really interrelated. Sometimes we don't talk about that either, right? So if you're feeling stressed all the time and anxious all the time, that can have an impact on your cardiovascular system. That can, right? Not to mention, for a long time, people can't even get in to see their doctor to deal with maybe minor ailments that then become more major ailments. So there's a lot happening both with physical and mental health. And although I would say mental health is not being ignored, it's certainly making the media, it's certainly being talked about, there's not a lot of action. So there's some action, but definitely not enough. And so I want to give people some resources, because we know that more than 1 in 5 people, so prior to the pandemic, it was 1 in 5 people is going to have a mental illness or mental health problem, and that has definitely increased. So it's a lot of people. So these are just some resources. Maybe, I don't know, we might be able to send these to you, or I'll leave them up for a second and talk about them a bit if you want to jot them down. So the first, these are kind of Canada-wide resources. I should say, I should have put it up on this slide, but it's really new, and I forgot to put it on there. The Nova Scotia, Nova Scotia Health, Mental Health and Addictions team also now has a really great website. So I think if you just Google Nova Scotia Health, Mental Health and Addictions, it's one of the first things that comes up. You can still access, sometimes their old site comes up, which just gives you information about the different services. If you're on the right site, it actually has links to helpful information and how to get help. So I can try to find that for people if they need it. So the first one is the Center for Addictions and Mental Health. So as I said, they've been keeping updated stats, but also just so much information on mental health and COVID-19 and things you can do to support yourself and other people. Handouts, strategies, lots of stuff there. The other is, it's confusing because the first is CAMH and this is CMHA. This is the Canadian Mental Health Association. They also have a ton of stuff. I checked it out, yesterday, just to make sure that things are keeping up to date, and they are. And they, for sure, the CMHA.ca website has things specific to do with mental health and work. They for sure have had a whole campaign about mental health in the workplace. And then the last one is the Canadian Psychological Association. Again, they're constantly adding different fact sheets about mental health and COVID-19. So these are all specific not to COVID-19 as the illness. These are specific websites for mental health, like the impact of COVID-19 on mental health and ways you can help. So another thing that really kind of exploded during the pandemic are internet-based resources. So before I talk about this, one thing to keep in mind is there's so much out there on the internet, and some of it is super helpful and some of it is super unhelpful. That's why I gave you some of those websites. Another thing to think about is there's different ranges of what you can get online. So you can just go to some of those websites, they just have information. So that's not a treatment, right? That's like if you have asthma, you might go online to find out a bit more about your condition, but that doesn't actually treat your condition. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is there's a lot of really good free websites out there, and they might have videos that talk about mental health, or even provide some strategies, and that's really great. But that really is for those mild mental health concerns, right? Somebody has to be kind of motivated enough to look at those sites and really sift through what's going on. Which again, for some people, for many people, that's great. But for someone who has enough anxiety or is suffering from depression that it's getting in the way of their daily functioning, that's definitely not going to be enough. So we've also moved to virtual services. So I know Nova Scotia Health, for example, they continue to provide, I think they've moved somewhat back in person, but they're definitely continuing to provide services virtually like this over Zoom. But what's interesting is we've also had something called internet-based cognitive behavior therapy around for a while. The UK and Australia are about a decade ahead of us. So a lot of the research came out of there first. And I'm going to talk about what this actually is in a second. So this is something that has been around for a while, and certainly the pandemic and the need for virtual care has increased the need for this substantially. So as I said, there's longstanding evidence of the effectiveness for these programs for anxiety and depression across the lifespan. There's programs for kids. There's evidence that it helps people over 60. It helps people in their youth. So there's lots of evidence for that. And as you know, we need it, one, if we're still doing social and physical distancing, that can be really hard to do in person. The other is flexibility, right? Again, there's a lot going on. And so people really might need that flexibility of just being able to do this from home on your computer versus going into an office to do it. And also to decrease the demands in the public healthcare system. We didn't have enough resources prior to the pandemic, and we certainly don't have enough resources now. So just quickly, what is CBT? You've heard it in my bio. I'm talking about it now. You're probably like, what is she talking about? So CBT just stands for cognitive behavior therapy. And the cognitive is just another word for thoughts. And then behavior makes sense. So as you see here, the root of cognitive behavior therapy, it's a skills-based therapy. It's not, the traditional things you see on TV, lie on the couch and tell me about your childhood. This is about an action-based, skills-based therapy. It's going to teach you things to manage your own anxiety and mood. This is certainly something that's done in person as well. That's what I did for many years. And I used to tell people my job is to make it so you don't need me anymore. That's really the idea is I teach someone these skills to help manage their own anxiety and depression. And once they have those skills, as a therapist, I back out. So it's the same idea with internet-based. So what the idea is that what we think affects how we feel. What we do affects how we feel, right? So our thoughts, if my thought is, let's say somebody's scared of dogs and you're walking down the street and you look over and you think, oh, that dog's going to bite me. Well, that's your thought. It's going to affect how you feel. It's going to make you anxious, and it's going to affect what you do because you're going to cross the street or run away, or right. And so these things all work together, and cognitive behavior therapy, as it sounds, really focuses on how do we help people have more balanced thoughts. Remember I talked earlier about people that tend to overthink, worst case scenario, catastrophize. So how do we help with the thinking piece? And then with the behavior piece, how do we help people face their fears? Because this is when a fear is irrational or unrealistic. So once we have that balanced thought, how do we help people then, when the dog's coming towards them, they can walk right by the dog without having to cross the street, because we know it's very unlikely the dog's going to attack them. One other thing just to think about in terms of why internet-based cognitive behavior therapy can be so helpful. A traditional therapy session is about 50 to 60 minutes, and obviously it's in person. Whereas internet-based cognitive behavior therapy, the idea is that there's some kind of website or manual or something that you work on yourself ahead of time, and then that session with your therapist or a coach doesn't have to be, that's the other thing, doesn't have to be, we'll talk about that, it doesn't have to be a therapist, is only 30 minutes. So it saves time for you there. Traditional therapy is maximum 1 time a week versus many internet-based cognitive behavior therapy programs. There's unlimited messaging, so you can talk to your coach at any time. Although it's not something that, it's not like, you know, I'm having a panic attack and you text your coach. It's like you text your coach and then like the next day they text you back, kind of thing. Traditional therapy, there tends to be kind of homework sheets that you take home, and I always joke, and then you lose them, and then you come back in the next week and you talk to me and I ask you about your sheets and you can't find them. Versus online, you complete the homework on the platform, you can see it, it's saved, your coach or therapist can see it, so it's great that way. So that gives you instant feedback on your progress as well, the platform itself, versus relying on your therapists to kind of tell you how you're doing. So that's why I co-founded, didn't invent ICPT, I co-founded Tranquility online with my co-founder, Joel Muse. So this is a digital cognitive behavior therapy platform. As I said, it is evidence-based, it's timely, it's stigma-free. I didn't talk about that in the previous slide. You know, I, as a psychologist, I of course wish that there wasn't as much stigma surrounding mental health. We've come a long way, but we're still not there, particularly in the kind of rural Nova Scotia, rural areas. People tend to still have a lot of stigma about going to a psychologist's office, so this kind of takes that away. Also, as I said, we use paraprofessional coaches that are trained by myself and another psychologist. And some people have really said, like, that also takes the stigma away of, I'm not really seeing a psychologist or a shrink, as people call us. I'm just talking to a coach who's just there to help me get through this program. It's personal, so there's lots of different ways that the program can be tailored for you. And it's accessible anytime, anywhere, wherever you have Wi-Fi, if you have a smartphone or a computer. So just so you know, we do have Tranquility available to support employees. So my co-founder's contact is there. And I think we're just on time to, a little bit early, but to answer some questions.
Okay, can you see me again, or are we back?
I can see you, yeah.
I think so. Okay, yes, great. Still technology, right? We've been using it for 5 months or 6 months now, but any case, okay. So thank you, Dr. Pencer. That was a very, very insightful presentation for me. So I have some questions, and then as a reminder to everyone, and I believe that there's just a message, please, if you do have some questions, then feel free to type them in the Q&A box. So our first question today would be, how do I know when my stress is at a point that it actually needs professional help?
Good question. Yeah, so the biggest way is, how is it impacting your life? So, you know, if you're just feeling a little overwhelmed or, you know, tired, and, you know, you can use some of the strategies I talked about, for example, and that seems to help, and then it maybe happens again a few days later, you probably don't need professional help. It's when it starts to impact your functioning on a day-to-day basis. Is it harder to get out of bed? Are you noticing a significant decrease in your productivity at work? Are you maybe withdrawing from your friends and family, or avoiding essential tasks that you really need to do? Yeah, is it really impacting kind of work life, home life, social life, things like that, to a significant degree that others would kind of notice and maybe be worried about you?
Right. Yeah. Okay. So this next question is close to home for me. It says, I am feeling overwhelmed working from home and providing childcare. How can I discuss managing expectations with my employer? Now, that being said, my employer has been fabulous through this pandemic, but personally not all of my friends and kind of professional network had the same experience, unfortunately. So how does that conversation start with your employer to kind of manage those expectations?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I agree that there's been a whole range, right, of employers that have been super supportive and understanding, and then ones that haven't. Um, I mean, I think it depends on, first of all, your relationship with your employer, right? If it's a positive relationship, then I think you can certainly um, broach the topic in a way that's maybe not just about you, right? You could kind of say, like, this is, as you know, this is a big issue during the pandemic for many parents. I'm finding myself, um, being a bit overwhelmed with all these responsibilities. I'm wondering if there's, specific things that we can talk about, maybe shifting, what do we say, pivoting, right? There's different things we can do to maybe work with that. Maybe there is other people in your workplace that you could kind of work together with them, so it's not just coming from you, so that it's more of a united front. And maybe it's you figuring out what you need to do, and then going to your employer with a solution, right? So rather than just going and saying, I have this problem, it's maybe like, okay, this is how I can manage, and going with that to them and saying, can I do this? And already having the solution.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Question from Diane Kenny, wondering if you offer the presentation in French.
Good question. I do not speak French.
A great question. I've hosted many webinars. I haven't received that question yet.
Yeah, no, unfortunately, I do not speak French. The presentation is not in French. Interestingly, our program, Tranquility, is about to be translated into French. So we do know that French, yeah, I know that not having enough resources from French is actually a big issue. So, so at least we're doing that. I don't speak French, but we've got official translators and French coaches coming in, so that's good.
That's right, yeah. Okay, here's another interesting question. So some of my team really enjoy working from home, and some want to be back in the office. Creating a disconnect is kind of creating more stress. So how can this new hybrid environment kind of be supportive for the stress, or work with the stress?
Sorry, I'm not sure I get the question.
How can I support this new hybrid environment?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that's great that as an employer, I think it's great when employers can support their employees in whichever they're more comfortable with. Because yeah, you're absolutely right. There's some people that really want to stay at home, and if that works for the type of job they're doing, that's great. And there's some people that are feeling like, I can't do this at home anymore. I need to be back in the office. And so yeah, there's going to be different stressors, right? So how do you support those different stressors? I think flexibility is key. I think that sometimes in our society we don't appreciate flexibility as much as we should, in terms of, it's okay if somebody, maybe the people working at home have something a little different than the people working, there's going to be pros and cons to both. And so I think it's okay to be flexible and figure out what works for the people at home, what works for the people in the office. And if you're starting to hear kind of murmurs of like, oh, it's not fair, or this or that, or people complaining about different things, is really working on being flexible and figuring out, is there actually an issue, or is it just people feeling overwhelmed? In which case, maybe it's supporting them in providing some of these resources we talked about today, some of the websites. I went to a talk earlier in the pandemic about how leaders in the workplace can support mental health. And I think the biggest thing is that stigma of, it's okay to just talk about it, right? It's, you're not going to, as an employer, say like, I think you're depressed, but it's okay to really kind of talk to your employees at a group and be open about recognizing that this is a stressful time, no matter where you're working or what you're doing, and maybe coming up with a strategy as an employer of just kind of general ways you can support them.
That's a nice transition into another question here. Can I or should I discuss my mental health concerns with my employer? And on that note, what about concerns regarding some of your colleagues?
Yeah, so I mean, I think for yourself, I think that's an easier choice, right? You can decide how comfortable you are talking to your employer about yourself. Um, I don't know all your employers, right? So I wanna be hopeful that they would be supportive. So you know your employer best. If you have a good relationship and you think they're going to be supportive, I absolutely would say you should talk to them, because one of the things that happens is if we don't talk about it, our employers are going to notice something, right? They're going to notice decreased productivity, or they're going to notice that you're not performing at the same level or expectation. And so if you don't talk about them about your mental health, they're not going to know what the reason is behind it. And my hope as a psychologist is if you talk about it being, related to stress and mental health, that there's actually ways to support that and help you with that, versus if it's just that you're not working very hard, there's not as much. It's going to be a totally different approach. So that's why I definitely would, if you can, talk to them, because it's going to be a different approach. As for people you're concerned about, I'm more likely to suggest talking to that person, right? To reach out to that person and say, I'm concerned about you. And again, using kind of the information we talked about today in terms of like, I was reading somewhere or I saw this psychologist talk and they were talking about how stress and anxiety and depression are more common in the pandemic. And I just wanted to reach out and see if you need me to help guide you with supports. I got this website, something like that.
Yeah. Okay, great. So a few more that came in through the Q&A box. One is, you mentioned mental health and addictions. Obviously, the anxiety and stress of the pandemic and the lockdown have impacted these significantly. Can you recommend ways we can encourage friends, coworkers, and client, if one is working in a program helping those with addictions, to seek help? And would CBT and Tranquility be able to help with mental health addictions?
Yeah, so I guess the question is maybe more about addictions. Certainly,
So,
CBT and Tranquility helps with anxiety and depression. That's what it was developed for. Um, if the addiction issue has been exacerbated by kind of stress, anxiety, and depression, there actually is some research to support, that CBT. Well, CBT does also work for addictions. It's just a slightly different way of doing it. But also, if you treat the anxiety or depression, if that's what's kind of pushing the addictions, then the addiction should also at least get somewhat better, if not, depending on how severe it is, for sure. And sorry, there was another part to that.
it would be, would CBT and Tranquility be able to help with mental health or addictions?
Yeah, so definitely mental health. That's what it's designed for.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's definitely designed for depression and anxiety. Yeah.
Okay. And a comment from Chris Blond. Thank you for this. He writes, I'm an employer and my staff have come to me. It is empowering to them and gives them a feeling of comfort that they are not alone. From the employer, it gives us an opportunity to help them through scheduling, tasks, etc. So thank you, Chris, for sharing that. I think that we need to continue sharing to support each other through this time.
Yeah.
So I believe I just have one more question here. I've got to get to it, and that will probably wrap us up. So this question came in as well. So my wait time for a psychiatrist is quite long. What type of wait times would be at Tranquility to get in to see someone?
Yeah, no, that's I didn't talk about wait times. Yeah, the wait times in the public system can be huge. There is no wait time for Tranquility. You literally log on, answer some questions, and you can be starting within minutes.
Excellent, excellent. So, and this is just one more from Sherry. I'm assuming there's a fee for this online service, and I'm wondering if it is under something that might be covered with medical plans.
Yeah, good question. Unfortunately, it's not covered under medical plans. We're hoping that this pandemic has shown that we need to be more flexible in what's covered for healthcare, because we do know that this internet-based cognitive behavior therapy is as effective as in-person therapy for mild to moderate problems. So it should be covered the same as everything else, in my opinion, but unfortunately it's not. So currently, for Tranquility, there's different programs out there, but for Tranquility, you can go online. There's a free 2-week trial, and then it's, if you want a coach, my understanding is it's $99 a month and should take about 3 months. So it's still way cheaper than a $200 an hour psychologist, and I can say that as someone who charges $200 an hour as a psychologist. So yeah, it's right now, but that's our goal at Tranquility, is actually to work with employers or insurance companies or the provincial government to really get this type of treatment covered in some way, so that people don't have to pay out of pocket. That's our long-term goal.
Excellent. Yeah. So Dr. Pencer, unfortunately, we're out of time. So we will have to wrap it up. So thank you everyone for who attended today's webinar. We hope that the discussion was helpful, and nice to know that we're all in this together. I love the metaphor that you used, and now I might not get it right, but same storm, different boat. Is that right? Yes. Excellent. I love that. So thank you, Dr. Pencer, for sharing your expertise with all of us. So join us next week for the Small Business Support Series with the Department of Labor and Advanced Education. We'll dive into how government hiring and training incentives, workplace hazards, labor standards, and apprenticeship opportunities. So question to the audience, do you have an idea for a webinar? And if so, reach out to our events team at halifaxchamber.com. So this webinar was recorded, as many of you know by now, and it will be available to all attendees shortly on YouTube. So thanks everyone, and enjoy your day. Be safe this weekend for Halloween.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you, bye-bye.